November 23, 1961, Penfield, New York. Two hunters walked through a frost-covered cornfield, their breath visible in the late autumn air. They were looking for deer. What they found instead was a human body, partially clothed, lying face down in the stubble. The corpse was positioned as though someone had simply opened a car door and rolled it out. But this wasn't a fresh kill. The body had been lying there for weeks, preserved by the cold New York autumn that had acted as a natural refrigerator. This wasn't a burial. It wasn't even an attempt at concealment. The body had been left in plain sight, dumped in a rural cornfield on the edge of a rapidly growing, affluent suburb, where discovery was inevitable and the shock value would be maximum. This wasn't carelessness. This was a message. The man's hands were destroyed. His fingertips had been burned away with blowtorches. His face was swollen beyond recognition. Burns covered his torso. The Monroe County medical examiner would determine that he had been strangled with a Garrett-style clothesline, twisted with a tool or stick for maximum effect. His jaw broken, his ribs smashed. But what made seasoned investigators pause wasn't just the brutality, it was the location and the timing. This body had been lying in this field since early October, through 6 weeks of autumn weather, waiting to be found. Whoever dumped this body wanted it found. They wanted it found by law enforcement. They wanted it found in a place where the violent underworld collided with the peaceful lives of families and professionals, where the contrast would be impossible to ignore. And they wanted everyone who saw it to understand that this death was designed to teach a lesson. The body belonged to Alberto Agueci. At 41 years old, he had been one of the most ambitious heroin traffickers operating along the Canadian-American border. He had connections that stretched from Sicily to New York City, from Montreal to Buffalo. He had moved hundreds of pounds of pure heroin through a network that would later become famous as part of the French Connection. Approximately 10 to 20 kilograms every month, month after month, over the course of years. The street value was in the millions. The human cost was incalculable. And he had made one fatal mistake. He had believed that his birthplace, his courage, and his connections made him untouchable. The cornfield proved otherwise. To understand why Alberto Agueci died the way he did, you have to understand where he came from. The Agueci brothers, Alberto and his younger brother Vito, were born in Castellammare del Golfo, a small town on the northwest coast of Sicily. In the underworld of the 1950s and 60s, being Castellammares meant something. It carried weight. The town had produced some of the most powerful mafia figures in American history, including Salvatore Maranzano, who had briefly controlled the entire Italian underworld in New York in the early 1930s. Maranzano had organized it, structured it, given it the rules that would govern it for decades. He called himself the boss of bosses. He lasted 5 months in that position before being murdered in his own office. But the Castellammares reputation survived him. The Castellammares clan was respected throughout the Italian underworld. Men from this town weren't just criminals. They were part of a tradition that stretched back generations in Sicily, built on codes of honor, on face-to-face agreements, on the primacy of blood ties and cultural loyalty. The Agueci brothers shared this heritage with Stefano Magaddino. This connection, this shared birthplace and cultural background, gave the Agueces a certain prestige, a certain expectation of respect when they entered the American underworld. In their minds, coming from Castellammare del Golfo meant they were dealing with the American bosses from a position of cultural equality, if not operational power. They were wrong about that. Fatally wrong. The brothers had immigrated to Canada in the late 1940s, part of the post-war wave of Italian immigrants seeking opportunity in North America. They settled in Toronto, opening what appeared on paper to be a legitimate bakery business. Agueci and Sons Bakery, located at 985 Queen Street West, was real enough. The ovens worked. The bread was baked. Customers came and went. The storefront looked like any other immigrant-owned business in Toronto's Italian neighborhood. But the real business happened in the back rooms and in the carefully orchestrated trips across the border. By the mid-1950s, the Agueci Brothers had become critical middlemen in an international drug network that was flooding American cities with heroin refined in Marseille, smuggled through Montreal, and distributed through New York and beyond. What made the Aguecis valuable and what would ultimately make them vulnerable was their position between worlds. They weren't American mobsters. They weren't Canadian gangsters. They were Sicilian-born, Canadian-based, American-connected traffickers who moved product and money across borders with a level of sophistication that frustrated law enforcement on both sides of the Niagara River. They saw themselves as independent operators, businessmen engaged in an illegal but lucrative trade. They believed their Castellammarese heritage gave them status, protection, a seat at the table with the major bosses who controlled the pipeline. They were wrong about that, fatally wrong. Alberto Agueci was the elder brother, and in every way that mattered, he was the driving force of the partnership. He was loud where Vito was quiet. He was ambitious where Vito was cautious. He was explosive where Vito was compliant. Alberto had the kind of personality that made him valuable in negotiations. He could be charming when he needed to be, intimidating when circumstances required it. But he also had something more dangerous. He had pride. He genuinely believed that his Sicilian heritage, his connections to the Castellammarese tradition, made him an equal partner with the American bosses who controlled the territories through which his heroin flowed. He spoke as though he were negotiating from a position of strength. In reality, he was an employee, and employees who forget their place don't last long. Vito Agueci was different. Younger, quieter, more aware of the precariousness of their position. Vito understood that they were operating at the pleasure of men far more powerful than themselves. He understood that the respectful silence, the nods of acknowledgement, the handshakes they received from bosses like Stefano Magaddino didn't mean equality. They meant tolerance, and tolerance could be withdrawn at any moment. But Vito also understood something else. In the Mafia, brothers are not treated as separate entities. If one brother becomes a problem, both brothers become liabilities. The crime families didn't see Alberto and Vito as individuals. They saw them as a unit. One unit that knew too much, that handled too much money, that could become too dangerous if things went wrong. This is the fundamental miscalculation that destroyed Alberto Agueci. He believed he was building a business. He was actually accumulating debt. Debt measured not in dollars, but in obligations, in knowledge, in exposure. Every kilogram of heroin that passed through his hands increased his value and his vulnerability. Every meeting he attended, every boss he worked with, every route he established made him more indispensable and more disposable at the same time. The Mafia doesn't allow anyone to become truly indispensable. The moment someone starts to believe they are, they become a target. By 1959, the Agueci operation had reached a level of sophistication that would have been impressive if it weren't so mundane in its execution. The brothers had turned family life into operational cover. On Sunday afternoons, Alberto and Vito would load their wives and children into the family station wagon, a nondescript Ford Country sedan, the kind that every middle-class family in North America drove in the late 1950s. They would announce a day trip to Niagara Falls, to the Buffalo Zoo, to visit relatives across the border. The children would be dressed in their Sunday clothes. The wives would pack lunches. Everything looked exactly like what it was supposed to be: a nice Italian-Canadian family enjoying their weekend together. What the border guards didn't see, what they had no reason to look for, was the heroin hidden in the rocker panels of the station wagon. These weren't crude modifications. The work was professional, nearly invisible even under close inspection. The drugs were vacuum sealed, carefully positioned to avoid any unusual sounds or weight distribution. The Aguecis would pull up to the Peace Bridge customs booth, children chattering in the back seat, and answer the usual questions with the practiced ease of people who had nothing to hide. Where are you going? To visit family in Buffalo. How long will you be staying? Just for the day. Anything to declare? Nothing at all. The guard would wave them through, and another load of heroin would enter the United States, transported by smiling parents and their oblivious children. This wasn't just clever smuggling. This was psychological warfare against law enforcement. The Agueces understood that border agents were looking for nervous single men, for vehicles loaded with obvious contraband, for the telltale signs of criminal activity. They weren't looking for families. They weren't pulling over station wagons full of children to tear apart the rocker panels looking for drugs. The Agueces had weaponized normalcy, had turned the innocence of their own children into operational security. It worked brilliantly, until the day it didn't. Once across the border, the business took on a different character. The family outings would end at safe houses in Buffalo's north side, particularly along Hurdle Avenue, the heart of the Italian community, where Magadino's influence was absolute. The station wagon would be unloaded by men who worked for Stefano Magadino, the boss of the Buffalo crime family. The heroin would be weighed, counted, and distributed. Money would change hands. Large amounts of money delivered in brown paper packages that looked like groceries. The Aguecis would collect their percentage, reload the station wagon with their families, and drive home. The children never knew they had been accessories to international drug trafficking. The wives, that's a question that investigators debated. How much did they know? How much did they suspect? The answer probably lies somewhere between willful ignorance and strategic silence. The Toronto operation was the other half of the equation. Albertus had established himself at the Royal York Hotel, the grandest hotel in Toronto, the kind of place where businessmen conducted negotiations over lunch in the wood-paneled dining room. Agueci would meet there with the suppliers, French Corsican smugglers, Montreal distributors, New York representatives. These weren't backroom deals in dimly lit bars. These were professional business meetings conducted with the formality of legitimate enterprise. Contracts were discussed, prices were negotiated, payment schedules were established. The only difference was the product being discussed, and the fact that everyone at the table was committing felonies with every handshake. The Royal York meetings established what would become known as a crucial segment of the Montreal-New York pipeline, a smuggling route that moved heroin from the Corsican-run laboratories in Marseille through Montreal and into the American interior. Instead of moving large shipments through major ports where customs inspections were thorough, the Agueces distributed the loads across dozens of smaller crossings, using the family station wagon method and variations on it. Furniture trucks carrying legitimate loads with secret compartments built into the frames. Delivery vans making regular business runs with drugs hidden in false bottoms. Even passenger vehicles driven by clean-cut associates who looked like salesmen or tourists. The bakery at 985 Queen Street West served as a hub for this operation, a place where legitimate business provided cover for the constant flow of people and vehicles that the heroin trade required. The volume per crossing was smaller, but the frequency was constant, and the risk of detection was dramatically reduced. But every crossing, every delivery, Every kilogram of heroin had to pass through Buffalo, and Buffalo meant Stefano Magaddino. If there was a single man who held Alberto Agueci's life in his hands from the moment the operation began, it was Magaddino. The Buffalo boss was 70 years old in 1961, but age had not diminished his control or his reputation for ruthlessness. Magaddino controlled what he called the Niagara frontier, every criminal enterprise between Buffalo and the Canadian border, from gambling to labor racketeering to increasingly heroin trafficking. He wasn't the most famous mafia boss. He didn't have the New York publicity or the Hollywood glamour of bosses like Carlo Gambino or Vito Genovese. But within the underworld, Magaddino was feared precisely because he operated in the shadows, because he was methodical, because he never forgot a slight or forgave a mistake. Magaddino's control over Buffalo wasn't just territorial, it was infrastructural. He owned the politicians who mattered. He controlled the unions that ran the waterfront. He had police officers and customs agents on his payroll. And most importantly for the Agueci operation, he controlled the distribution network that turned raw heroin into cash. The Aguecis could smuggle all the drugs they wanted across the border. But without Magaddino's approval and cooperation, those drugs had nowhere to go. They were entirely dependent on him, and he made sure they never forgot it. Magaddino operated through legitimate businesses that provided perfect cover for criminal enterprise. His primary headquarters was the Magaddino Memorial Chapel, a funeral home in Niagara Falls where he could meet associates under the guise of legitimate business. But the actual handoffs, the meetings with the Aguecis, often took place at locations like the Cavalier Motel or in social clubs along Hurdle Avenue in Buffalo's North Side. These were places where cash changed hands routinely, where people came and went without raising suspicion, where surveillance was difficult and community loyalty was guaranteed. The heroin moved through Buffalo hidden in legitimate commerce, in vehicles that carried both legal goods and illegal drugs, in packages that looked like ordinary deliveries. Millions of dollars and hundreds of pounds of heroin flowed through Magaddino's territory, hidden in the everyday life of a working-class city. Alberto Agueci met with Magaddino's representatives regularly during this period, collecting payments, discussing logistics, negotiating rates. The meetings were superficially cordial. There would be respect, even friendliness, questions about family, compliments on the smoothness of the operation. But underneath the pleasantries was an unspoken calculation. Magaddino was measuring Alberto, his usefulness, his reliability, his potential as a future problem. And increasingly, the Buffalo boss was seeing red flags. Alberto talked too much. He boasted about the operation's success. He mentioned numbers, routes, names. Not to outsiders, Alberto wasn't stupid enough to talk to civilians or law enforcement. But he talked to other criminals, to associates, to people who might repeat what they heard. In the Mafia, talking too much is more than a breach of etiquette. It's evidence of poor judgment, of a dangerous lack of discipline. And poor judgment is a liability that can get everyone arrested. Worse, Alberto was starting to act like an equal. In meetings, he would push back on Magaddino's decisions, would argue about percentages, would suggest alternative arrangements. To Alberto, this was simply business negotiation, the kind of back and forth that happens between partners. To Magaddino, it was insubordination. There were no partners in his organization. There were bosses, and there were workers. Alberto Agueci was a worker who had forgotten his place, and that kind of forgetting was terminal. The French connection was tightening. That's the phrase federal investigators used in early 1961, and it was accurate. For years, law enforcement on both sides of the Atlantic had been tracking the flow of heroin from Turkey to Marseille to North America. But the network was diffuse. international and sophisticated enough that prosecutions were difficult. Then, in late 1960 and early 1961, several things happened simultaneously. Informants started talking. Wiretaps captured conversations. Surveillance operations documented meetings. And most crucially, investigators from the RRCMP, the FBI, and the NYPD began sharing information in ways they never had before. In May 1961, the network began to collapse. Arrests happened across multiple jurisdictions: New York, Montreal, Toronto, Buffalo. The Agueci brothers were indicted on federal narcotics charges. The indictments were detailed, specific, and devastating. Prosecutors had evidence of multiple shipments, financial records, testimony from co-conspirators who had been arrested and were now cooperating. Alberto and Vito were facing decades in prison. The organization they had built was being dismantled by investigators who suddenly understood how all the pieces fit together. For Vito Agueci, this was a catastrophe, but it was manageable. He understood that arrest was always a possibility in their line of work. He hired lawyers. He made bail. He prepared for trial. He kept his mouth shut. For Alberto, the indictment was something else entirely. It was an insult. He had moved hundreds of pounds of heroin for the American families. He had taken all the risks of crossing the border, of meeting with suppliers, of handling the product. And now, when he needed help, when he needed the expensive lawyers, the political connections, the resources that the big bosses had access to, he was being treated like a common criminal, like a low-level soldier who was on his own. Alberto wanted Magadino to pay for his legal defense. In his mind, this wasn't an unreasonable request. He had made the Buffalo boss wealthy. He had never stolen, never informed, never caused problems. Now he needed support, and he expected it as a matter of course. Magadino saw things differently. From his perspective, Alberto was already too exposed, too vulnerable, too likely to be pressured by prosecutors into cooperation. Paying for Alberto's defense wasn't just expensive. It created a paper trail, a connection that could be traced back to him. And if Alberto was eventually convicted, if he was looking at a life sentence, how long would his silence last? Magadino's answer to Alberto's request was delivered indirectly, but it was clear: you're on your own. This refusal ignited something in Alberto Agueci that had been building for years. All the perceived slights, all the ways he felt he had been disrespected, all the money he believed he was owed. It all crystallized into rage. He began making threats. Not cautiously, not privately, but openly, loudly, recklessly. He told associates that he had been betrayed. He said he would go to Magadino's funeral home, the Magadino Memorial Chapel in Niagara Falls, and tear it down brick by brick. He said he would expose everything, would tell investigators exactly how the network operated, who ran it, where the money went. He said he wanted what was owed to him, and if he didn't get it, everyone would pay the price. These threats were relayed back to Magadino within hours, and with those threats, Alberto Agueci signed his own death warrant. In organized crime, there are rules about murder. You don't kill someone without approval from the leadership. You don't kill someone whose death will attract unwanted attention. You don't kill someone unless it's absolutely necessary. But there are exceptions, and one of them is this: you can kill anyone who threatens to cooperate with law enforcement. Alberto's threats weren't just bluster to people who knew how the system worked. They were evidence of his willingness to become an informant. Whether he actually intended to cooperate or not became irrelevant. The threat itself was enough. Magadino gave the order, but he didn't leave the execution to chance. The murder had to send a message, not just to Alberto, but to everyone in the organization. It had to demonstrate what happened to people who threatened the boss. It had to be brutal enough to deter anyone else from making similar mistakes. And it had to be public enough that the lesson couldn't be missed. What followed was a masterpiece of psychological cruelty, a murder that would become legendary in law enforcement circles for the sheer, calculated malice of its design. The setup was almost gentle in its deception. In early October 1961, Alberto received word through intermediaries that a meeting had been arranged. The message was conciliatory. Magadino wanted to work things out. The bail money Alberto needed, it would be there, waiting for him. All he had to do was come pick it up. The threats, the anger, the harsh words, those could all be forgotten. This was family business, and family disputes could be resolved. There would be a meeting at a secure location, away from prying eyes where they could discuss matters privately and settle accounts. Alberto was suspicious. He had threatened the boss, after all. But he was also desperate. He needed money. He needed support. And he needed to believe that the relationship could be salvaged. On October 8, 1961, Alberto Agueci drove to meet with Magadino's representatives. The location wasn't a public restaurant where witnesses might see him, where his presence might be remembered. It was a farmhouse in the Buffalo Niagara area, the kind of isolated property where privacy was guaranteed and screams wouldn't carry to neighbors. Alberto arrived believing he was picking up bail money, believing that his threats had been taken seriously, that his value to the organization would be recognized. He walked into that farmhouse a free man. He would never walk out. What happened in the hours after Alberto entered that farmhouse is documented through forensic evidence recovered 6 weeks later. The torture began immediately. Alberto was systematically beaten. His jaw was broken, his ribs were smashed. He was strangled with a garrote-style clothesline, the rope twisted with a stick or tool to ensure maximum suffering, pulled tight in the signature enforcement method of the Castellammarese tradition. And he was burned with a blowtorch, the flames applied methodically to his body. The torture likely lasted through the first day, perhaps into the second. Alberto Agueci was a strong man, stubborn and proud, but no one survives that level of trauma indefinitely. Within 48 hours of his disappearance, he was almost certainly dead. The torture wasn't just about extracting information, though interrogation was certainly part of it. This was punishment. This was demonstration. This was a message being written on human flesh. The questions would have come between the beatings, between the applications of fire. Where's the money? Who have you talked to? What have you told them? But the answers didn't really matter. Alberto's fate had been decided the moment he made his threats. The torture was about making an example, about creating a body that would tell a story to everyone who saw it or heard about it. The torture focused particularly on his hands. His fingertips were methodically burned away with blowtorches until no prints remained. Each finger was destroyed individually, a process that would have taken considerable time. But this wasn't just about preventing identification. The Monroe County Medical Examiner's Office would identify the body through other means. The destruction of the hands carried symbolic weight. In the Mafia, everything is symbolic. The hands represent action, ambition, reaching for things. Alberto had reached for money that wasn't his. He had reached for status he didn't deserve. He had tried to grasp equality with men who were his superiors. The destruction of his hands was a message to anyone who might make the same mistake. This is what happens when you reach too far, when you try to take what belongs to someone else, when you forget your place in the hierarchy. When Alberto finally died, from strangulation, from the accumulation of trauma his body could no longer sustain, his corpse was handled with deliberate carelessness. He was partially stripped, placed in a vehicle, and driven to Penfield, a rural area on the edge of Rochester's expanding suburban development. The choice of location was as calculated as the torture had been. This wasn't a remote dump site in the wilderness. This wasn't an industrial area where bodies were occasionally found. This was farmland being transformed into neighborhoods where professionals and their families were building lives, where children would soon play, where the sudden appearance of a mutilated corpse would shock not just law enforcement, but the entire community. The body was rolled out of the car into a cornfield and left there. Through the rest of October and into November, as autumn turned toward winter, Alberto Agueci's corpse lay in that field. The cold weather preserved the body, maintained the evidence of torture, kept the message intact. For 46 days, the physical proof of what happened when you threatened Stefano Magaddino lay waiting at the intersection of rural farmland and affluent suburb, a time bomb of horror waiting to detonate in the consciousness of everyone who would eventually see it or hear about it. This wasn't concealment. This was exhibition on a timeline designed for maximum impact. The hunters found the body on November 23, 1961. The Monroe County Sheriff's Office responded, followed quickly by FBI agents and RCMP investigators who had been tracking the Agueci brothers since the May indictments. What they found in that cornfield became a turning point in the investigation of organized crime in upstate New York and southern Ontario. The body had been there for 6 weeks. The forensic evidence was detailed, specific, devastating. The Garrett-style strangulation with a clothesline, the broken jaw and smashed ribs, the methodical burning with a blowtorch, the destroyed fingertips. Every wound told a story about how the Buffalo family operated, what they were willing to do, and how they viewed anyone who challenged their authority. The FBI assembled a task force specifically to investigate the Agueci murder. Agents from the Rochester office worked with RCMP officers from Toronto, sharing information in ways that were unprecedented at the time. The investigation revealed patterns that would later become foundational to understanding Mafia torture murders. The use of fire as a primary tool, the symbolic destruction of body parts as messages to the criminal community, the deliberate placement of bodies in locations designed to be discovered, where the contrast between the victim's brutalization and the surrounding community's normalcy would amplify the shock. The Garrett-style clothesline, the broken bones, the methodical nature of the violence, all of it became part of a growing database that federal investigators were building to understand how different crime families operated. The Agueci case became a classroom for federal investigators learning to decode the language of Mafia violence. The investigation also revealed the scope of the heroin network that Alberto and Vito had helped build. Agents traced shipments backward from Buffalo to Montreal to Marseille. They documented the family station wagon runs, the rocker panel modifications, the meetings at the Royal York Hotel, the operations out of the bakery at 985 Queen Street West. They identified dozens of participants in the network, from low-level couriers to high-ranking bosses. The investigation would eventually contribute to major drug prosecutions on both sides of the border, and it provided early intelligence that would feed into the larger French Connection cases that dominated narcotics enforcement through the 1960s. But the impact of the Agueci murder reached far beyond the immediate investigation. In Washington, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy had been building a case that organized crime was not a collection of independent ethnic gangs, but a sophisticated national criminal enterprise. Kennedy needed proof, hard evidence that would convince skeptical senators and a doubting public. The Agueci case became that proof. Kennedy personally viewed the murder as a smoking gun that demonstrated the Buffalo mob's reach into Canada, their willingness to use extreme violence to protect their interests, and their coordination with other crime families across North America. The brutality of Alberto's death, the international scope of his smuggling network, the clear connection to Stefano Magaddino, all of it became ammunition in Kennedy's war against organized crime. The Agueci murder would have its most significant public impact in September 1963, nearly 2 years after Alberto's body was found in that Penfield cornfield. A low-level soldier named Joseph Valachi became the first Mafia member to publicly testify about the organization's structure and operations before the Senate. The Valachi hearings were designed to prove that Cosa Nostra was real, not an invention of law enforcement or a product of ethnic prejudice, but a disciplined national criminal entity with rules, hierarchies, and enforcement mechanisms that operated across state and international borders. Alberto Agueci's murder became one of the key exhibits in those hearings. Valachi described the torture, the message, the methodology. He explained what the murder meant within the organization, how it functioned as communication and control, how the destruction of Alberto's hands carried symbolic weight that every made member would understand. He detailed how the garrote-style clothesline was a signature of certain families' enforcement arms, how the placement of the body was as important as the violence inflicted upon it. The brutality of the Agueci case helped convince senators and the American public that organized crime was more sophisticated, more dangerous, and more ruthless than most people had imagined. The cornfield in Penfield became evidence not just in a murder investigation, but in the transformation of how America understood and prosecuted organized crime. But the investigation into Alberto's murder itself never produced charges. Despite the evidence, despite the testimony from informants, despite the obvious connection to Stefano Magaddino, no one was ever charged with Alberto Agueci's murder. The reasons were practical and legal. Informants who could testify were either dead or too terrified to appear in court. Physical evidence connected the crime to the Buffalo organization generally, but not to specific individuals in ways that would hold up in court. And Magaddino himself was insulated by layers of associates and intermediaries who had carried out his orders. The boss had ordered the murder, but he had never touched Alberto Agueci himself. Proving the connection beyond a reasonable doubt was impossible with the evidence available. Vito Agueci survived his brother by decades, but survival came at a cost. He was convicted in the 1961 narcotics indictments and served time in federal prison. When he was released, he returned to Toronto, but he was a marked man in ways that had nothing to do with law enforcement. Everyone in the Italian underworld knew his brother had been killed for threatening to cooperate. Everyone assumed that Vito might make the same mistake, might try to avenge his brother, might become a similar liability. He lived under a cloud of suspicion and potential violence for the rest of his life. Vito never spoke publicly about his brother's murder. He never testified against Magaddino or anyone else in the Buffalo organization. He kept the code of silence that Alberto had broken, but it didn't save him from the consequences of Alberto's actions. In the Mafia's calculations, Vito was permanently contaminated by his brother's betrayal. He had survived, but he had lost everything that mattered: his business, his status, his brother, and most crucially, his safety. He lived as a ghost in his own community, present but powerless, alive but functionally dead in the eyes of the criminal world he had once been part of. The murder of Alberto Agueci accomplished exactly what Stefano Magaddino intended. It sent a message that reverberated through the underworld from Toronto to New York City. The Buffalo boss was not to be threatened, not to be disrespected, not to be challenged. Despite being 70 years old, despite operating far from the media spotlight that followed the New York families, Magadino proved he was as ruthless and powerful as any boss in the country. The Agueci murder became a case study in regional mafia power, demonstrating that territorial control and local connections could be just as dangerous as the national profile of bosses like Carlo Gambino or Vito Genovese. Within the organization, the murder also clarified the hierarchy in brutal terms. The Agueci brothers had believed their Sicilian heritage, their Castellamarese connections, their operational success gave them status. The cornfield body was the refutation of that belief. Status came from one source, the approval of men like Stefano Magadino. Everything else, heritage, success, connections, meant nothing if the boss decided you were a problem. The murder was a reminder to every soldier, every captain, every associate. You are replaceable, you are expendable, and the moment you become more trouble than you're worth, you're dead. But if the Agueci murder was intended to intimidate and control, it also had unintended consequences for the organization. The brutality of the killing, the public nature of its discovery, the obvious connection to organized crime. All of this brought attention that Magadino would have preferred to avoid. Federal investigators who had been focusing on narcotics suddenly took a hard look at the Buffalo family's structure, its finances, its political connections. The investigation into Alberto's murder opened doors that led to other investigations, other prosecutions, other revelations about how the Buffalo organization operated. The Agueci case also provided crucial training for a new generation of federal investigators who would later dismantle organized crime families across the country. Agents learned how to read the signatures of different families' enforcement arms. They learned that torture wasn't just violence, it was communication, a language that could be decoded to reveal structure, hierarchy, and decision-making processes within criminal organizations. The techniques pioneered in investigating the Agueci murder would later be applied to the development of RICO statutes, the federal laws that finally gave prosecutors the tools to indict entire organizations rather than individual criminals. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the world that had produced Alberto Agueci was disappearing. The French connection was being dismantled by coordinated international law enforcement. The heroin pipeline from Turkey through Marseille was disrupted by political pressure and diplomatic agreements. The old bosses were dying or going to prison. Stefano Magadino himself would die in 1974 at the age of 82, having outlived most of his rivals and many of his own soldiers. The Buffalo family he had ruled for 50 years would fracture almost immediately after his death, torn apart by succession battles and federal prosecutions. The era of regional mafia power was ending, replaced by a new reality where federal surveillance, RICO indictments, and informant testimony made the old ways of operating impossible. The Agueci brothers had lived and died at the intersection of two criminal worlds: the old Sicilian traditions they had been raised in, and the new American drug economy they had tried to profit from. They believed they could navigate both worlds, could use their heritage as protection while pursuing American ambitions. They were wrong. The old traditions offered no protection once they threatened the new power structures. The American bosses didn't care about Castellamarese prestige or Sicilian honor codes. They cared about money, control, and silence. Alberto Agueci provided money, challenged control, and broke silence. That combination was fatal. There's a final bitter irony in the Agueci story that investigators noted, but rarely discussed publicly. Alberto had used his own family, his wife, his children, as cover for his smuggling operation. He had put them in the station wagon, had driven them across international borders, had used their innocence as camouflage for felonies that could have resulted in their arrest along with his. He had weaponized his family life, had turned Sunday outings into criminal operations, had exposed his children to risks they couldn't possibly understand. And in the end, he was destroyed by the family he had been working for, killed by men who used that same word, family, to describe their organization while demonstrating that loyalty flowed only upward, that protection was conditional, that the moment you became inconvenient, the family would discard you as casually as rolling a body out of a car into a frozen cornfield. The body in the cornfield was found on November 23, 1961, 46 days after Alberto Agueci disappeared. The murder was never officially solved. No one was charged. No one was convicted. But everyone knew. In law enforcement offices in Buffalo and Toronto and New York, investigators knew exactly what had happened and why. In the Italian communities across the border, in the social clubs and the restaurants and the bakeries where men conducted business in quiet conversations, everyone knew. The knowledge was the point. The message was the point. Alberto Agueci had reached too far, had spoken too loudly, had forgotten the fundamental rule of the organization he had chosen to join. You are not a partner. You are never a partner. You are a tool. And when the tool breaks or becomes dangerous, it gets thrown away. For 60 years, the story of Alberto Agueci has served as a cautionary tale in the study of organized crime, a reminder that the Mafia's use of the word family is one of history's most successful propaganda campaigns, a linguistic trick that disguises a brutal business organization as something warm, protective, and loyal. Real families protect their weakest members. Criminal families eliminate them. Real families value loyalty as a reciprocal bond. Criminal families demand loyalty upward while offering none in return. Real families preserve their members' lives at all costs. Criminal families calculate the cost-benefit analysis of every member's continued existence and act accordingly. The cornfield in Penfield, New York, is now developed land. Houses stand where Alberto Agueci's body was found. Children play in yards that were once frozen stubble, where hunters stumbled upon a corpse with destroyed hands and a burned face. The physical evidence is gone, buried under decades of suburban expansion. But the message that body carried, the message written in torture and left to cure in the cold for 6 weeks before discovery, that message survived. It survived in the memories of men who knew Alberto Agueci, who attended his funeral, who looked at his closed casket and understood exactly what was inside. It survived in law enforcement files, in case studies used to train new generations of investigators, in the Senate testimony of Joseph Velaki that helped transform American understanding of organized crime, in the prosecutorial strategies of Robert F. Kennedy, who saw in this murder the proof he needed that the American Mafia was real, powerful, and operating with impunity across international borders. It survived in the calculations of every criminal who heard the story and understood the lesson. No one is untouchable. No connection is strong enough. No heritage prestigious enough to save you if you threaten the men who control the machine. Alberto Agueci died believing he had been a partner in a business. He died learning he had always been a tool in someone else's operation. The difference cost him his hands, his life, and his dignity. The cornfield where his body was found was the final classroom in his education, the place where his corpse taught everyone who saw it the truth he had learned too late. In the Mafia, there are no partners. There are only bosses and bodies. And Alberto Agueci, for all his ambition, his Castellamarese pride, his connections, his operational success, ended up exactly where the system always intended him to end up. Discarded in a field, a lesson for others, a message sent and received, a warning that remained effective decades after his hands had turned to ash. And his name had faded from everything except the files of investigators who studied murder as a language and learned to read its grammar in the burns and broken bones of men who had forgotten their place.